Thank you very much indeed to the organisers, Steph and team, for inviting me. I met with Steph last year. I think I was supposed to meet with others, but they weren't available. And she told me about the work of the Transforming Self and Other group. And it was music to my ears. I believe very strongly in this work, and that Buddhists and a Buddhist Sangha should have a large impact on the world around it for the better, because there's a lot of impact that needs to be had for the better. So I was absolutely delighted and very pleased indeed to be invited to address this gathering. I was thinking that when we first came to find this place, we'd previously been in North London. The main centre was in North London. And we had to leave the building we were in. Triratna and Mangala will remember it well. And it was a short-life property, and the council were taking it back and were going to redevelop it. So we had a massive search all over London. And eventually we found this place. And at the time there was a debate. Bethnal Green in 1975 or whatever it was, too long ago, before the Ice Age, was absolutely solid, traditional Cockney, white, working class. Absolutely, pearly queens and all the rest of it. Well, I never saw any, but I'm sure they were there. It was really very, very traditional in that way. In fact, it was here that a very important sociological study, family and kinship in the East End of London, was written just round the corner. And at that time, yes, it was a very working class area. We were a bunch of white middle class kids, mostly, some exceptions. The idea that Buddhism could flourish in a solidly working class area didn't seem realistic. Bhante, however, was absolutely delighted that we were going to be in an area that was outside our usual constituency. After all, he himself was white working class from South London. That's what his background was. And so he was always twitting us on the fact that we were a bunch of white white middle class kids. And he hoped that, well, through being here, we would make our order broader and that it would cross the barriers of class. So you could say that right from the start, this centre was founded with what we now call diversity in mind. At that time, it was mainly an issue of class diversity, but diversity has so many other meanings now, other relevances now. So I'm very glad indeed that, through your work, you are in various ways addressing that sort of issue and fulfilling the original purpose of this centre. Today, though, I'm not going to talk directly about that much more, because I'm going to talk about my experience of working in India and a little bit about my experience working in Hungary, in both of which we do cross those barriers. And of course, the title of this group is Transforming Self and World. I thought I'd just start a little bit on transforming self in relation to all of that. I think probably my work in India mainly, but more recently in Hungary, I've been working in India for 35 years. That is, I've been going to India and supporting the work of others there. I go for, over the last so many years, 20, 25 years, I've been going for 3 months in India, 3 months here, 3 months in India, 3 months here. So I'm off on Monday back to India for 3 months. And I've been going to Hungary for 2 weeks every year to work or to support Roma Buddhists who are connected with our movement, who are Mitras. And I've been doing that for about 15 years. And these two experiences of working in India with mainly Dalits that is, those people who are formally considered untouchable in the caste system, right at the bottom of the heap, and experience of working with Roma, who in some ways are even more excluded and marginalised than Dalits. Dalits are at least part of the same culture as the other castes, and although Dalits tend to be darker and the higher castes tend to be lighter, it's not so easy to tell. It's not so easy to tell. There are other ways of telling. Indians have an infallible sense of people's caste, just as English people have an infallible sense of people's class, but it's much more extreme in the case of caste. But with Gypsies, there's no question about it. Roma, you just see somebody, you know they're Roma because they're darker usually, and they're going to be much poorer, and they've got a different walk differently, they move differently, they speak differently. Apparently, I don't speak Hungarian, but they apparently use a dialect that is discernible. You can immediately tell. So yes, we're in both those situations. The question of reaching beyond our boundaries is important. But mainly, what I want to start by talking about is how that's affected me. It's affected me in a huge way. Yes, and I say probably more than anything else I've done, in combination with everything else, in combination with meditation and study and so forth. My work with people who come from a very, very different culture from my own, whose experience of life is very, very different to mine, has had a very powerful effect on me. I am a white, middle-class Englishman with a public school, that means private school for the non-English, education, and from a particular era when the class system was still quite strong, actually. In the village I was brought up in, there was definitely a sense that we were above. I didn't accept that, but at the same time, of course, I'm marked by it. And I worked hard to overcome class barriers in my own mind and to reach out. But one never really knows the extent to which one's background and culture condition one until you come up against people from a very, very different one. And I think I was probably fairly good and open-minded, but still there are barriers in the mind, mainly barriers of hesitation and embarrassment and unease and not sure how to behave, not sure what to do, which of course go with the middle-class English white conditioning. But when you come across people, when you come into active and close communication and dialogue and friendship with people from such different backgrounds, you discover what your conditioning is much more powerfully. And once you discover your conditioning, you come to a different relationship with it. So I can never stop being a white, middle-class, ex-public school Englishman of a certain education and so forth. That I will always be that, because it's a fact. It's just a historical fact. But through that interaction with people from backgrounds that are almost the exact opposite of my own, moreover from a completely different culture in terms of national culture than my own, I've been able to see my own culture much more clearly, my own conditioning, and sort of come to terms with it. It's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. I didn't do, some of the things that have happened to people. I wasn't responsible for various kinds of oppression and injustice. I've done it in minor ways, like we all have, but in a larger cultural way, I've never bought into the class system or racism or whatever. But still, I don't have to take personal responsibility for what that is as a whole, but I can take responsibility for how I act on the basis of the benefits, the advantages, the particularities of my own conditioning. And my connection with people in India, my connection with people in Hungary has really helped me in a very, very powerful way to do that. And of course, that is getting down to the heart of Buddhist business. Buddhist business is to overcome self-attachment, if you see what I mean. You can't overcome self-attachment if you don't know what it is. Most of self-attachment is under the surface. The obvious bits are relatively easy to deal with. So I think sometimes you hear people talking about gaining insight and so forth. You think, okay, yeah, up to that level, but what about all that? So, yes, we need to discover who we are, not in a judgmental way. It's not bad to be a white middle class, etc., even if white middle class people have participated in colonizing the world and oppressing people or whatever, however you want to talk about it. But I need to take responsibility for the conditioning that I've been given without any, by your leave. I didn't ask for it, but I've got to take responsibility for it and make sure that I do not identify with it and therefore act in relation to others on that basis, if you see what I mean. And it's not easy. Not at all easy for anybody on any side of the question. But wanting to work with people in India has been probably the most powerful thing. More recently, with the Roma in India, it's in Hungary. It's more powerful still, but in a very particular way. With Indians, with Indian Dalits who have converted to Buddhism, they are so delighted to be in contact with Buddhists from another culture, and they don't judge you as being, for instance, the former colonial oppressor, because their memories of the British, by and large, is that the British broke down the caste barriers to a very limited extent. They didn't do it nearly enough, but they did provide opportunities for education, health, and so forth. So they, by and large, look to the English, the British, as having had a beneficial effect as far as they're concerned. So yeah, there's no prejudgment. You're not walking into a situation of prejudice or anything like that. But you are walking into a situation where people's minds work in very different ways. Fundamentally, of course, all minds are the same. But in immediate terms, they sort of see the world differently. For a start, they all come from traditional families, so there's a sort of an emotional roundedness that goes with that doesn't go with a nuclear family, particularly of a middle class southern kind. It's different in the north. Again, one has to think of that. So I'm immediately being in relationship to people who work differently, who feel differently, who see the world through different spectacles. So in India, for instance, all relationships are filtered through family relationships. So your uncle, auntie, brother, big brother, auntie, big auntie, beti, beta, son or daughter. So all relationships are seen through the lens of family relationships, which actually we all do, but in India it's quite explicit. And that's common in traditional societies. You relate to different people through the family relations. I remember even as a child here, the various close friends of the family were auntie this and uncle that. But in India, it's absolutely universal. People will come up to you who don't know you and just say, "Uncle, please, can you tell me the way?" or something like that. So that's already very different. People have a much stronger sense of embeddedness in a society, in a community. They have a very strong sense of being embedded in a community because their community, which largely means caste, is their social security mechanism, and their network of family friends is a social security mechanism. So, most people spend a lot of time eating ladus at weddings. Ladus, a big, very sweet Indian cake, sweet, which are given out at weddings. They're very sticky. so you have to go to lots of weddings because you have to go to the weddings of your relatives so that they will help you when you need help. And of course, you get the letters to make up for it. But so people see their lives through the network of their connections. I don't. I come from a radically deracinated background where I hardly know my relatives. They used to come for Christmas, but I'm not even quite clear who is who anymore. And where I got away from my family as quickly as I could. It's just not the way people do things in India. They love their families. They stay very close to them. They feel a strong sense of responsibility. If somebody's in trouble, everybody will give or take care and so on. So it's already very, very different. One of the most immediate things I noticed is that they didn't understand cynical humour, which is a terrible disadvantage. They just didn't get your jokes. And they don't have that, again, probably white middle-class English, self-deprecation. They don't understand that. And so on. You can make a long list of the sort of things that you suddenly find doesn't work. And they will say things, I really like you, you are my friend, sort of, we just met. And, you don't display emotion quite so quickly. It takes a long time. So that already I found very, very challenging. And I was supposed to be there as a very senior order member, conducting ordinations and so forth. And I felt quite lonely, quite uncertain of myself, quite shy, and all sorts of things like that to do with my particular background and conditioning of my personal conditioning, as it were. And had no idea what I was talking about. I tried to talk to people about it. They had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. Would look over the sort of puzzled and slightly pained and friendly look on their faces. They just didn't know what I was talking about. I then become much more aware of how much of the way I see the world, which is, I think, the way the world should be seen, is actually just to do with my very particular national, class, family, personal conditioning. And it breaks down a bit. Breaks down, yes. I do not wish to claim that I finished the job, but I've changed a huge amount. I know how to relate to people in India, not as a sort of false set of tricks that I've learnt, but I've just learnt to tune in. And in tuning in, I've changed. They say, don't they, if you acquire a new language, you acquire a new soul. And I remember when I was in Spain, I learnt Spanish, and I discovered I was different in Spanish. I was a different person in Spanish. Not again, that I'd put on a display of being Spanish, but that the language and the culture and the sun all brought out something different in me. So this issue of diversity isn't just a moral imperative, if you see what I mean. It's not just something that we ought to do because the Dhamma is for everybody and we ought to avoid discrimination and barriers. That is all true, and it's perhaps objectively speaking the important thing. But subjectively, or in terms of our own personal transformation, that work to overcome barriers is a very powerful tool of self-transformation, I would say, in discovering yourself, in seeing yourself more clearly. You do not see yourself clearly until you come into a contrasting relationship, which throws up what you're like, if you see what I mean. And then you can own it, and then you can work with it. As I say, I'm not going to stop being a white, middle-class, educated Englishman of a certain era. I can't stop that, and I can't pretend it. To begin with, I used to pretend that I was working class and put on an accent, which anybody who's working class could see through in an instant. Stop laughing, Triratna. But it's not a question of that. It's just a question that you drop attachment to that and just relate, human to human. and you find the way through. And, if you're lucky and there's somebody trying to find the way through from their side, something deeply human takes place. It's been a bit different in Hungary because there I've encountered what I didn't encounter in India, which is a great deal of mistrust because Hungarian gypsies, and it's no doubt true, well, I've seen it in Slovakia as well, I'm sure it's true for gypsies in Central Europe and probably elsewhere too, a great deal of hostility and suspicion and a great deal of barrier. So, for instance, we mainly don't do it now, but we used to work, our friends used to work in a village in Northern Hungary, Sajókaza, which is about 20 miles from the Slovak border. And the village is about half Gypsy, Roma, half Hungarian. Hungarian means white. I am a Hungarian in Hungary. The two communities, live in slightly separate parts. There's a bit more interchange now, but there are 2 or 3 gypsy ghettos. There's no other word for it. And when I walk down the streets with one of the Mitras who's not a gypsy but is completely identified with them and is the headmaster of the school, the Dr Ambedkar High School, and so on. When I walk down the road with him, all the white people will greet me. Yonapot Kivanuk, Yonapot Kivanuk, all the way down the street. And the gypsies know Tibor and they love him, so they respond. When I walk down with one of my gypsy friends, nobody will look at us. So they live side by side in a village, and they just do not even acknowledge each other. They just pass each other by as if they couldn't see each other. I found that difficult to absorb, if you see what I mean. And of course, that's been their experience of Hungarians, white people, and so they're suspicious. Damn right. Quite right to be suspicious. That's been their experience. So they were friendly enough, but cautious in relation to me. They knew that, at least the leaders knew that, from Western Europe, there wouldn't be the same responses. But still, they know that we're dominant. They know that we can do what we want. We can make the world the way we want it to be, and they're worried about their initiative being taken away and being told what to do and told how they should be doing things. So I had to learn how to win trust, if you see what I mean. Not as a tactic, but I just had to start by just tuning in. And it didn't come easily to me. I'm a doer, so I wanted to do something. I didn't speak Hungarian. Still don't speak Hungarian. It's a ferociously difficult language. But I had to just sort of tune in and be around and be teased, for instance, which is pretty merciless. Unfortunately, Subhuti means something extremely rude in one of the gypsy languages. I'm not going to tell you what it means, but you can imagine. And they'd all be laughing their heads off and had no idea what they were laughing at. And I feel humiliated, embarrassed, angry, but couldn't show it, etc. So having to sort of just slow down and, why am I here? I'm here to connect with fellow human beings who are very different to me, who even my being in contact with them can help them, because it demonstrates that outside of Hungary, people really do have an interest in them and a concern for them. I know that Donna Samudra, who worked with me for a while in Hungary, went to see somebody, a gypsy lady who was responsible for gypsy studies at the Central European University, which is a George Soros-funded institution. It's now been chased out of Hungary, but that's another story. She sort of said to the lady, well, what should I do? She said, look, just you coming here means something. Just the fact that you're here and you're interested and you want to be friends and you're willing to listen and you're not pushing your point of view, that all counts for a lot. And it's very humbling just to think that your mere presence, just because you come from outside that situation, can be beneficial. But what's happened as a result of my learning the hard lesson of being patient and of not thinking there's anything for me to do. I can't do anything there. I don't speak Hungarian. I don't understand the situation. I can't really do anything. All I can do is hang around and get into communication. And I have. And with some of the leaders, the gypsy leaders there, well, they're among my close friends and people with whom there's very close mutual feeling and of love and support. And they say that they find my biannual 1-week visits, even though I don't do anything, just hang around, they find it useful. So that has also helped me to change myself, if you see what I mean, through tuning in really behind the very painful experience that a gypsy in Central Europe almost inevitably has, and setting aside my own comfort and convenience and relative, as it were, easy dominance without even thinking. By setting that aside, I've come to something more human in myself and been able to reach other people from a human perspective. So that's, yes, transforming self. A very powerful tool of transforming self is connecting with people from a very, very different culture from oneself, and even from a very different socio-economic position, and learning to see very clearly what your own conditioning is, whatever it is, even if it's from the other side of the equation, as it were. Learning to see what it is and learning to not be ashamed of that or guilty about it, because that's useless to everybody and mars the relationship. But just being not operating from that, if you see what I mean. All my life, doors have just opened for me. I don't come from the top of the tree, but every door that I've walked up to has just opened in front of me, like one of those electric doors, and I just walk through. I've never had any serious difficulty in my life of that kind, socially. Not that I've ever done a proper job, but any work that I've done, I just need to start speaking and people can hear my accent and I'm through. But that's not the experience of a marginalised gypsy in Northern Hungary, who's probably never really been outside his or her village, doesn't even really know where that village is. One of the things they found to begin with in setting up the school that I'm going to talk about in a minute was that had no idea where they were in Hungary. They knew they were in Hungary. They didn't really know where Hungary was. They didn't know where other countries were. They had no idea of time. So if you talk about Julius Caesar and then talk about Martin Luther King, they assume they're contemporaries, as it were. They've got no sense of space and time. They just live in a sort of eternal present, just surviving and trying to have as much fun as they can. Oh my goodness, do they have fun? No sense of orientation. Whereas, for me, it's got it from the moment I stepped from the womb, started being implanted in me. So having to sort of step aside and relate to people, they're just as good human beings as me, in some ways better, in some ways I'm better, but you just relate, you just communicate. And this is a very, very powerful medicine, spiritual medicine. So that's transforming self. And I think if you want to transform world, it's very important to start from that basis, that to acknowledge that what you're doing is, in a certain sense, fundamentally for you. Do you see what I mean? The worst thing you can do is go in patronising. If you go in patronising, everything you do will be tainted by your implicit sense of superiority. And I think this is why Buddhists have such a lot to offer, because we do emphasise communication. We do emphasise non-selfhood, selflessness. So we have the basis for going into those sort of situations with humility, with a self-reflection, looking back at ourselves, at where we are coming from, what we bring into the situation, and with metta, that means with an openness to the human being who's in front of us. So if we don't do it like that, we're just another set of do-gooders, charity workers, which thank goodness there are such, but we've got something extra to add to it, which is that whatever work we do is challenging the boundaries at root and making a partnership where, we've got resources here that they don't have, for instance, in India. Without Karuna Trust and actually just donations from Mitras and order members, things would not have got going in India. Well, wouldn't have got going in the way they have in India. Who knows what would have happened if it hadn't. But a lot of the early buildings and the early work was done with money coming from the UK. I remember we here at the LBC, before the LBC was opened, we gave £1,000 for the buying of land and the building of a centre in Pune, which was the first major centre. £1,000 in those days was a lot more than it is now. In those days, I don't know what the price comparison is, but it was a great deal more. I mean, you think our weekly pocket money when we were doing the building work was £2. So it must be about 20 or 40 now, I suppose. Anyway, so we did. We provided what we had, and they didn't have. But when you start going there, you realise they've got something that we don't have. For a start, they've got a very strong sense of social responsibility, a very strong sense of duty to their community and to their brothers and sisters who are still disadvantaged. And they're very, very concerned about larger political and social questions, mainly on that front, on the front of Dalit inclusion, if you see what I mean. So they're very, very worried about certain actions of the government. They're very keen to promote some of the policies of Dr Ambedkar that have meant huge change in the Dalit position in India, in a way that you don't often come across here. People, certainly in my sort of background, you don't come across that kind of concern. But it's just everybody has it. If there's some terrible atrocity or something like that, everybody's really upset and wants to do something about it. If there's some move by the government or the local government or something that is repressive or just insensitive in some way, they want to go and do something about it. They want to demonstrate. They want to activate their networks and so on. So they're sort of instinctively, socially, politically active in a way that generally people are not here, which I think this grouping is intended to rectify. Am I correct? Yes. And I know Surya Gupta is very, very concerned about this field too. There she is. But they have that, really, really at the forefront. In some ways, you could say, to a fault, the sort of that is more important to them than the transforming self. And you could caricature, as I said the other night, the relationship between the two is that they emphasise that pole, we emphasise that pole. And so there's a very fruitful interchange, which is productive for both. And then they come from a culture within which natural human responses are not suppressed or made complex. So, for instance, they have an unashamed sense of faith. They're really easily able to feel great faith and devotion, and very, very moving. Of course, it's primarily towards Dr Ambedkar, about whom I will talk in a minute, if I can work my way there. But to the Buddha, to Bhante, and to, that is our teacher, our founder, and very easily, very naturally, they'll just sort of look up to people. Again, sometimes to a fault. Sometimes they look up when they shouldn't. But by and large, they're pretty canny. But that sense of reverence and of ability to, as it were, look up, which is so complex for us here, it's very much vitiated by our own history, and it's not so easy for people to give in, as it were, or let those feelings flower. In India, it's just natural to them, and a lot of emotional positivity that goes with that, just general emotional positivity. So it can be quite a shock, in a very positive sense, to wake you up to your own cynicism, your own suspicion, caution, boundariedness. I speak for myself, my own, and it's extremely refreshing. As it happens, I've been practicing the Dhamma for a lot longer than anybody else in India, any of the Indians in India, and I'm better educated. I've got a wider reading in Buddhism, so I've got a lot to offer them, but I can only do that on the basis of really recognizing how much they offer me, and how dear they are to me, and what wonderful opportunities they give me to express my understanding, because you can't really understand until you can express, and you can't express until somebody's willing to listen. And you can only express to the extent to which they're willing to receive. In other words, to match you, to keep communication with you. And they're just wonderful to talk to. You're wonderful too, but they have qualities that are not so common, certainly in the background from which I came. And it's enormously beneficial. In Hungary, something very similar. I won't go on because I need to get on to a little bit more explanation. In Hungary, by the way, the main work that's done is the running of a school, a high school, called the Dr Ambedkar High School, Gymnasium, in a city now, Miskolc, which is the second city of Hungary. It's quite small. 150,000 or something like that, with a large gypsy population, and where gypsies can't easily relate to the education system. They go to school, they're quite unruly often, they have no background of education, there are no books in the family, whatever, and you know that even in Britain, a predictor of how people will do in the school system is the amount to which, the number of books that are in the home. And, those who do achieve without that, it's a big effort for them. It's for me, there are just books all the time. So, of course, I just easily moved into it. Not very highbrow books, but there were books. Amongst, I doubt if you'd see a book in a gypsy ghetto. I haven't looked, so I'm just guessing. It's an oral culture. Storytelling is still very much alive. So when they go, and a lot of play. They get on remarkably well together. Very, very lively, humorous. Music is extremely important for them, and some extraordinary music. Dancing, some wonderful dancing. So they go to school, and it's sitting in rows, chalk and talk, by teachers who do not really believe that gypsies can learn, because they're genetically inferior. It's quite commonly held amongst Hungarians, and who just not interested. So many gypsies leave primary school unable to read and unable to add, and not knowing where Shaokaza is in the world. So, if they can't go on to high school because they're not able to relate to it, so our friends have set up a school which is, it's controlled by gypsies. The Jai Bhim network is a Triratna front organisation, which it's owned by all gypsies apart from one Tibor, It's a very important principle, learnt from Dr. Ambedkar, that the best way to help people is to help them help themselves, and to give them responsibility for themselves, and to support them in that responsibility. And Tibor, I have to say, has been quite superb, and János, who is a gypsy, the sort of leader, has responded in the same sort of way. So they have their own board which manages the school. School has to have qualified teachers, so Tibor is the headmaster, but János is a key teacher. A number of other gypsies teach there, and they're able to create an atmosphere that gypsies feel comfortable with, and they're able to see, okay, you can't read, you're now in the 15th standard, so okay, let's go back to where it all went wrong, where you lost connection with education, and then they can bring them forward, and often quite quickly with the right sort of help. And I went there this time just a week ago, and I had this huge change in the atmosphere, and I had, mainly through Tibor, but to some extent in English, which they couldn't speak at all before, I had quite deep conversations about what is freedom and what is happiness. And we were able to, have a really intelligent, thoughtful, self-aware conversations around that, to some extent in English. I couldn't have done that when I first went out 15 years ago. So they've managed to find the way to bring young gypsies into education and help them, many of them, not all, to get through high school. There's still a problem of getting them into university. They do get to university, but they don't flourish there because they don't have the same support. So that's the next question. But it's a Buddhist school. They don't teach them to meditate or anything like that. That'd be just a joke. I've taught meditation, and it was a joke. They were all falling about, laughing and giggling and talking about me, about Subhuti and all that. It's just completely the wrong thing to do. So one has to find the level at which, well, the right language, the right point of connection in order to communicate about the Dhamma. People sometimes just need food. They provide 2 meals a day because they don't get decent food at home. Often they provide a hostel for students who maybe have a lot of difficulty at home, violence at home or whatever, because families tend to be very broken because the men are in jail and the women have huge numbers of children, to exaggerate wildly. Because that goes with poverty, doesn't it, and marginalisation. It's not because they're gypsies, it's just because they're very, very poor and marginalised. And so they often need extra help of that kind. And it's extraordinary work. So amongst the Dalits, it's at a much more advanced stage. You probably all know about Dr. Ambedkar. Those of you who are doing the Mitra study course, there's a module on Dr. Ambedkar there. But very briefly, Dr. Ambedkar was himself born an untouchable in 1892 in India, and experienced active casteism, untouchability, in a very overt form. Not allowed into the classroom, had to sit outside, and brought his tiffin box, his lunch box, put it with the others, and then all the others had to throw their boxes out because they'd been polluted by his box. Do you understand? So the touch of an untouchable pollutes. So it's a sort of moral, religious, psychological tainting. So anything connected with an untouchable, that is now we call Dalit, taints whatever it comes in contact with. And food is a major issue of caste. So, putting his lunchbox with theirs meant they all had to be thrown out. So he had to put up with all of that. Fortunately, his father had been in the British Army in India and had therefore got an education and had some sort of confidence in possibility, and really strongly encouraged his children, and especially the future Dr. Ambedkar, to get a very good education. And he was exceptionally intelligent, attracted the attention of a philanthropic Maharaja who paid for him to go to Columbia University in New York, and then to come to the London School of Economics and Gray's Inn. So by the time he got back to India, he got 3 doctorates. He's one of the most educated men in India. But he experienced still that, as far as others were concerned, he was an untouchable. There's a famous story that he worked in a government office, and he was being groomed to take over a ministry of a princely state, Baroda. And so he'd sit at a desk in his cabin, Indian English for an office, and the peon, that is the office servant, whose job was just to bring the tea and the water and move files from one desk to another, who was, higher caste than Dr Ambedkar, would not give him the files directly. He'd stand in the doorway and throw them onto the table, because if he'd given them to him, he would have been polluted. So other incidents that just made him completely despair. He thought that education would be enough. He thought that now he would be free from the taint of caste. But he realized that caste went much, much more deeply into Indian culture and into the Indian psyche. And he therefore sort of dedicated himself to working to overturn that. He worked a lot in labour agitation. He led, interestingly, allied to communists, a mill workers' strike in Bombay. Very, very poor, usually Dalits, and the active suppression of union activity. So he worked with the communists to bring about demonstrations and so forth, which eventually changed that to some extent. He performed various agitations, like taking water from a public tank, leading a whole lot of Dalits to a public tank and drinking the water from it directly, which immediately polluted the whole lake, which is a big problem. So they had to conduct a purification ceremony, and I delight in telling people this. What does the purification ceremony consist in? The 5 products of the cow. Okay, there's ghee, there's butter, there's milk, and then there's cow dung and urine. So the touch of a human being, even the indirect touch of a human being, pollutes, but the dung of a cow purifies. So we're into deep irrationality here. But he led that sort of campaign really to give confidence and courage and to get the caste Hindus to pay attention. Of course, they merely dug in. He made a temple entry campaign, because Dalits are not supposed to go to Hindu shrines because they pollute the shrine, and so on. I won't go into it all. He eventually became politically active, founded a political party, gained local representation, and at a certain point was recognised by the British authorities as a leader of the Untouchables, Dalits. We stop calling Untouchables from now on. It's done its job in using that term. But he was taken into the Viceroy's administration as a Labour member, and formed really the basis for Indian labour law. After independence, he was taken into the cabinet, the Nehru cabinet, the first independent cabinet, and then as law minister, and then asked to chair the Constitution Writing Commission. So the Constitution of modern India, the Republic of India, is written by a Dalit, substantially written by a Dalit, which is something caste Hindus do not like to dwell upon. But hats off to Nehru, who was a good socialist and didn't believe in caste and tried to overturn it as best he could up to a certain point. So he was very influential. He tried to bring into Parliament a bill to give married women property rights. And it was blocked by the Hindu right, what is now the BJP, the government in power. And Nehru felt that he could not push against that because it was his own right wing, shades of David Cameron and all that. So or John Major, more to the point. So he became deeply, deeply disillusioned. He said, we've got in India, as good a constitution as anywhere, a constitution that guarantees freedom and rights and that has a democratic structure that's pretty resilient. But the plain fact is, without social democracy, you can't have an effective political democracy. Unless there's a change, and I'm quoting him here, there needs to be a change in the fundamental social culture. He was against independence, not in the long term, he was not in favour of colonialism, but he thought that independence should not be given until there was a higher degree of social democracy. Because he knew, and he's been proved right, that political democracy without social democracy would mean that the democracy is dominated by caste influence. So he saw this very clearly, which didn't make him very popular. He was not at all happy with Gandhi, by the way. It's a long story, but he thought that Gandhi's approach and campaign was not the right one. It's arguable, but we won't go there. So he became deeply disillusioned. We've got this wonderful constitution. We've got the framework of the law that is, approaching the standard of everywhere else. We've got a fine bureaucracy at that stage, but we don't have social democracy. I still, for instance, he was a barrister. Most caste Hindus would not employ him. And after all, a barrister is just a hired mouth. But the fact that hired mouth was a Dalit tainted it, as it were. So he had been thinking for a long time about the roots of caste. And he realised, the roots of caste are in the mind. It was one of the most important statements he made. Something like, caste is not a brick wall or a line of barbed wire. It's not a thing. It's not something objective. It's a notion, a state of mind. And then later he says, what mind creates, mind can undo. So he's bringing Buddhist principles to bear upon this fundamental social and political question. And he realized that the Dalits had to get out of Hinduism, in which they'd never really been accepted. And they had to find a religion that underlay what he referred to as his principles of a just and free society, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But not from the French Revolution, he said, from my master, the Buddha. And of course, his interpretation was not merely political, it was moral and ultimately dharmic. And he said that in order for there to be genuine social democracy, and for therefore a political democracy to function effectively, there needs to be a radical transformation of the culture. The greatest thing the Buddha ever taught the world is that the world can only be changed by a change in the mind of man, of humanity, and of the world, which I think could be a sort of a slogan for this group. That's the way the world is changed, is by a change in attitude. Change that attitude in different ways, that's another debate. But fundamentally what needs to happen is a change in attitude. And in 1956, he led, at the first instance, 400,000 of his fellow Dalits out of Hinduism into Buddhism in 1956, October the 14th, 1956, a date that should live in every Buddhist's mind. And then, of course, as over the weeks that followed, he conducted other conversion ceremonies. He had planned a huge campaign all over India, but he died just 6 weeks after conversion. However, the movement went on. There are probably now 50 million Buddhists, at least Buddhists to some degree. And when they become a Buddhist, they gain human dignity. They're not, most of them, going to meditate. Yes, they do know Buddhist morality, and they will try to live by that. But they don't think in terms of Buddhism in the way that most people who come into a centre like this are thinking of it. For them, Buddhism gives them the human dignity, the sense of their own equal worth with others around them, the sense that they're free from the stigma of caste, and a sense that their moral life is what is important for society. So very, very basic messages, you might say, of claiming humanity, which are not easy for a huge number of people in this world. They don't have that opportunity because of the systems around them, which encase and contain them, and in many cases teach them that they're inferior. And he taught that that's where it started. He certainly had the whole spectrum of Buddhism in mind. He himself meditated. He had a mantra. Om Mani Padme Hum was his own personal mantra. He did Vandana. He did puja every day. He was widely studied. He learned Pali so that he could read the original texts. He was a polymath. He knew so many languages. But his fundamental message was claim your dignity. He said that our fight is a revolution in the human personality, a fight for human dignity. And I think that is what we as Buddhists need to recognize, that being a Buddhist and spreading the Dhamma does not mean just opening a center and teaching meditation and about the Dhamma. That is important because in the end it guarantees everything else. You need depth if you're to have breadth. But there needs to be the right relationship between depth and breadth. So what it means is, in Hungary, helping gypsy youngsters to claim their own dignity, to feel that they are worthy human beings, and that give them the tools, the educational tools, to actually live that out. Because it's not so easy if you just don't read or can't understand the society around you and so forth. And to stand up and speak up. And I've seen them. We had I mustn't tell too many anecdotes, I could go on all day. But they were taken to the theatre to see a Hungarian version of a play by Molière, Don Juan. And after the performance, they were called into the front, and the actors sitting on the stage then had a sort of discussion with them. I was so proud of them. They just, they were quite challenging. They were quite pushy, searching. The actors were clearly delighted because they got a really live audience which was paying attention. And that is Buddhism. You see what I mean? It's not only Buddhism, but as a Buddhist, that's where you need to start with those particular people. They haven't got the materials to meditate. Some do, but it's just not sort of in their area of interest, as it were. They're not there yet. But they can grow as individuals, and as individuals, some of them will become Buddhists in the sense that we tend to think of being a Buddhist. And like we had a conversation. I had a conversation with a group. Some of them are from Slovakia, the gypsies from Slovakia who speak Romani at home, the gypsy languages, which are related to Hindi. They're in Slovakia, so the official language is Slovak, but their sort of official language is Hungarian, because it used to be part of Hungary. So they've got 3 languages, none of which they speak properly. So they come to the school, and they're given a very good education, and they're very, very bright. We had a really interesting discussion about equality. So I just put it to them, look, I'm a white Englishman, educated, I've got a university degree, I'm 72, you're young gypsy, just in your 10th year at school. Are we equal? They said, of course we are. Well, why? What is it that makes us equal? And they really enjoyed that sort of discussion. I said, I believe we're equal, but in what sense are we equal? We didn't really quite finish it because the bell went, and they were off as soon as the bell went, the Pavlovian reflex. But They really rose to it. That is Buddhism, if you see what I mean, in that situation. So crossing boundaries and trying to transform the world means trying to see where the Dhamma begins. And it's very likely in many situations to be at the human level, just helping people to claim their humanity, which they've been denied by culture, and often even by political denial or certainly social denial. And yeah, you know all about it. But often that's the question, is helping people to claim their human dignity without a Buddhist label on it. And yeah, if some of them make that transition, great. Some of them become Christian priests, great. It doesn't matter. Well, in a way it does, but in a way it doesn't. I think it's better if they become this, otherwise I wouldn't be a Buddhist. But still, it's better that they become something influential and with a real grounding in humanity than that they remain in poverty and isolation and exclusion. And drinking, drugs, girls pregnant at 13, 14, 15, it's just normal. And then just standing around with a broom in your hand with a high visibility vest to get €200 a month. This is a government scheme, which they think is to make sure that people gaining benefits get to earn their benefit. My friends are inclined to think is a way of keeping them subordinate, because the dole is given out by the village mayor, so it's his way of keeping his gypsies under control. Anyway, I could go on. So my main point is that I've learnt from the point of view of transforming self, that in coming into an interaction with others who can benefit from something that you bring, you will benefit as well, perhaps more, because you will be led to transcend your own particularity and to reach to the particularity of another, and thereby to what transcends that, to your humanity, your shared humanity. So that's the lesson I've learnt on the self side. On the other side, on the side of transforming the world, what I've learnt is that Buddhism doesn't always come with a Buddhist label. Buddhism starts where people are, and you have to have, in a very open-minded way, a willingness to help them to become full human beings, if you can, with education, for instance, without any expectation, without any urge to turn them into good Buddhists and so forth. If they do, that's great. But yes, in India, it's more possible to start with conversion, if you see what I mean. Conversion in India is a way of claiming human dignity. It's not so much for the Hungarian gypsies. So there you have to start with education. So I think these are the two lessons I would like to suggest we can learn from work at transforming self and world. You will transform yourself because of transcending your own particularity, and you will help to transform others to the extent that you reach to them as they are, where they are, and if you can help them, so much the better, whilst remembering all the time you're the one that benefits. So that'll do for now. I had to keep myself a bit in check because there's so much I could say. I could talk all day and every day. But let's have a cup of tea. Yeah, is that the good plan?